Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar today. I'm Emily Collins, Knowledge Exchange Manager at AHDB Dairy, and I'm joined by world-renowned vet, Dr. Michael Overton. To start off with, we're just going to run through some housekeeping. So all participants are muted. Please do ask questions throughout the presentation by using the question box to the right of your screen, and all the questions will be private to the organisers only, so don't hesitate to ask anything. We aim to be finished by 2:15. Thank you. Before we start, I'd like to say that a lot of the information in this presentation today is covered in detail in our calf management resource, which is available both online and in a hard copy by contacting your local knowledge exchange manager, where details will be online if you're not in regular contact. We've also got lots of other tools, including notably our heifer rearing cost calculator and calf milk replacer energy calculator, as long as videos ranging on topics from ventilation to cleaning and disinfection, and these can be really useful as a reminder or using with new staff. So now to introduce our speaker, Dr. Mike Overton, joining us all the way from Georgia. Mike has worked in practice for over 8 years before more recently working for Elanco and now for Zoetis as Global Dairy Platform Lead in Precision Livestock Farming. We're very lucky to have you, Mike. Thank you for joining us. So I'll hand over to you now.
Okay, thank you very much, Emily, and good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining the presentation today. I'm going to share with you some thoughts I have around the management of newborn calves as well as dairy replacement heifers as they age. And I'm going to finish up today with some work I've done around the cost of respiratory disease. How does that impact performance of these dairy heifers and future productivity? So as we start thinking about the raising and the management of replacement heifers, I think it's always helpful to kind of begin with an end in mind. So a lot of times we focus on these nice young calves, but what is it that we're actually trying to target? And for me, that target is looking at having a healthy, well-grown replacement animal at calving that is now large enough, healthy enough, and able to enter the herd and produce milk as we expect her to. So kind of with that in mind, I thought we might want to go and view some goals of the replacement heifer program. So with that, here's my idea of what the replacement heifer program should do. It should, in an efficient and economical manner, these are both very important concepts, but it should produce high quality, healthy replacement heifers that have the genetics, the frame, the body condition, and of course the management background in order to breed an early age. I'm not talking about breeding just based on age, but having the adequate size, which we'll review together in a few minutes, in order to be able to calve for the first time at a roughly 23 months. We also want these animals to be healthy enough and prepared properly so they experience minimal disease issues like ketosis and mastitis and metritis and displaced abomasum. We want them to have the ability to reach her production potential even in first lactation. And in order to do that, we've got to have them well grown. We want these animals to conceive in a timely manner during the first lactation. And of course, the ultimate goal is to yield you, the producer, the higher profits that these animals can bring to you. Now, in order to make this happen, there are certain requirements that must be met. We have to be able to have adequate and efficient growth of these dairy replacement heifers. And by that, I mean having adequate frame growth as well as lean tissue buildup in these animals. And one of the things I want to point out and emphasize to you is that the younger animals are the most efficient in terms of converting nutrients into lean tissue gain. And so we want to capitalize on that by making sure that we provide high quality rations, high quality milk replacer, grain mixes, and so forth in order to capitalize on that at an early age. Of course, we want good health, and that starts right away at birth and goes all the way through the entire raising process. We know that dairy replacement heifers that have disease issues are more likely to either die or be culled from the herd prematurely, even before calving. And if they calve in, they are more likely to have challenges as a cow and not produce to the full potential. And so a lot of what I'm going to describe for you today are how do we improve our management in order to try to improve her immune function, and how do we try to focus on management to minimize disease challenges and the effects of these different disease challenges. And we'll also talk briefly about timely and efficient breeding. We can do the first few things really well, but we can lose some of the efficiency within the raising process if we don't do a good job with breeding management of replacement heifers. Now, as I've already alluded to, calf and heifer nutritional management affects many things. Of course, with the young animal, having enough nutrients in place, enough calories, enough protein. And then on the young calf, we're talking about primarily enough milk to meet her ongoing energetic needs. It affects her ability to grow, but more importantly, I want to emphasize this really a lot today. If she doesn't have enough milk early on in life, it affects her ability to cope with cold stress, and it increases the risk of these animals developing disease issues, respiratory disease, and diarrhea diseases, because it affects their immune function and their overall health. So we really have to focus on providing adequate amounts of milk or milk replacer, and then transitioning that calf over to solid grain. And so as this animal transitions from a wet calf to a growing heifer, we know that how we continue to feed and manage these animals affects their age at first service, age at first calving. It affects the production as an adult. It affects her livelihood or her livability in the herd. And of course, it impacts the lifetime economics. Now, one of the commonly stated goals from a young calf perspective is that we want calves to double birth weight by 60 days of age. Well, to me, that's a really easy goal to achieve. And in fact, I would recommend that we want these animals to more than double birth weight. So if we take a typical Holstein, let's just say a Holstein calf is 40 kilos, then we want her above 80 kilos by 60 days. Well, if we do the math, that's an average daily gain of about 0.67 kilos per day. Not very impressive. A better, and to me, still very achievable goal for daily gain is going to be above 0.8 kilos per day. And what that does is gives us a larger, healthier, well-grown animal that is now capable of continuing to grow well. And it sets her up for future productivity benefits. And we'll cover that in just a bit. So if we think about historically what calf and heifer management has looked like in the past, oftentimes we've tried to feed calves very limited milk in order to try to, quote, save money. And the result of this also means that we get calves switched over to starter grain more quickly. Okay, I'm not saying that's the right thing. In fact, I'm going to argue that's not the correct thing. We tended to wean calves at a specific age as opposed to focusing on how much they're eating and are they capable of being weaned in a safe and healthy manner. We started breeding animals at a specific age instead of focusing on their size. And unfortunately, we tended to view the calf and heifer program simply as a cost area instead of looking at it as an opportunity and investment in the future herd. Many times we've seen rations formulated for a least cost per day basis instead of focusing on cost per unit of gain, or focusing on feeding the right ration that's going to provide the long-standing benefits of more efficient growth in a larger frame animal at calving. And then once we did all these things, we wondered why our heifers had so many health problems, and we wondered why they never performed as well as we might expect them to after calving. And I just want to ask, isn't it a bit obvious? If we do things and continue to do things in a less than optimal way, we will continue to have less than optimal replacement animals. And so I'm going to try to point out some opportunities for correcting some of these things today. Now, what are some of the reasons that calves get sick? And first of all, I'm going to focus on these wet calves, calves that are prior to weaning. For me, one of the big ones, of course, and you've heard this before from your veterinary advisors, I'm sure, is not enough colostrum. Either that's not enough volume being fed, is not high enough quality, or perhaps the timing of the colostrum feeding was not optimal. And what it did was result in inadequate protection for the very young calf. We can also see more diseases occur when calves have a high exposure to different pathogens like bacteria and viruses, other organisms like Cryptosporidia that are present in its environment. And this is why we focus on things like clean and dry and good air quality. The third thing I'm going to focus on here a little bit is this idea that I've already introduced, and that is not providing enough calories or enough protein predisposes these young calves to developing different disease issues. We know, for example, that many calves will have some type of diarrheal disease, typically 7 to 10 days of age. A lot of that's related to crypto, which is an organism that affects many young calves. We also know that if we're feeding these calves more aggressively from a milk perspective, that the impact of that particular organism has on the calf is greatly diminished. The calf is much better able to deal with that challenge. And so we want to focus on making sure we provide adequate colostrum, transition milk, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and then make sure that we provide the right amount of milk or milk replacer. We also want to make sure we have a good, healthy environment for these animals. Again, I mentioned clean and dry from a bedding perspective, but also good air quality, fresh air. We need to make sure we're getting good ventilation for these areas. Poor air quality is one of the big contributors to respiratory disease, whether it's young calves or older animals. And of course, the temperature stress that I've already mentioned, that I know you guys are very familiar with, being cold and damp much of the winter, creates additional stresses on these animals that predisposes them to getting sick. Now, if we think about some of the reasons that the older heifers get sick, this is now looking at the after weaning. I think one of the biggest ones we have to deal with and be aware of and try to avoid is this mismanagement or poor transition from the milk feeding phase over to the weaned calf. We've got to make sure these animals start to consume grain at an early age, continue to eat grain, so that at the time that we're ready to wean them from milk onto grain, they are capable from a gut perspective to actually handle the extra grain that they consume, and that they can deliver to themselves sufficient nutrients to meet their ongoing growth and development needs. Otherwise, we end up having many animals somewhere between 1 to 3 weeks after weaning that have or develop respiratory disease, for example. Again, the environment is important to manage it so that we can avoid major issues with temperature stress and air quality. We know that animals that had disease as a young calf are going to be more likely to have a recurrence or another episode after weaning. So that's another reason for trying to reduce the risk of disease of the young calf. We also know that high exposure, again, to different pathogens, things that cause disease, or perhaps not targeting the right immune response within the calf itself, creates a greater risk of disease. And so in terms of the acquired immunity that I'm mentioning here, what I'm focusing on there is that we have the right vaccination program delivered to the right animals at the right time to help provide some additional insurance, so to speak, against animals becoming sick. Now, here's my own personal opinion about the calf and heifer health. Many of the health problems we see are management related. And so what that means is that many of the health issues we see on virtually all farms today can be prevented with the right strategy, the right nutrition, the right housing management, and so forth. So what I'm focusing on here is that control for these different disease processes should be focused at prevention rather than simply focusing on the right treatment. So again, I try to focus people or help people focus more on how do we prevent disease instead of how do we do a better job at detecting and treating disease. Because if we can prevent disease, we go a long ways towards improving the health and productivity of these animals, as well as lowering the cost to you, the producer of these animals. Now, the two big issues we have to deal with in the calf and heifer is calf diarrhea, and to me, that's mostly a hygiene, environmental issue, as well as nutritional issue. And of course, that's going to occur mostly in the first 30 days of life. And again, primarily the first 2 weeks of life. But we also see quite a bit of respiratory disease. Respiratory disease can affect calves prior to weaning, but it can also affect heifers after weaning. And again, we know there's lots of different risk factors associated with respiratory disease. The other thing I'll mention is that we often see respiratory disease following on the heels of calf diarrhea, which is another reason to focus on reducing the risk of diarrhea as a young calf. Now, I've talked a little bit about some of the pitfalls, some of the management issues. I'm going to share with you now some of my ideas around growth targets for heifers. And again, I'm focusing on Holsteins, so the exact numbers wouldn't be the same for other breeds. But from a Holstein perspective, we're going to start off by assuming the mature cow body weight for the herd is averaging about 700 kilos. Now, the mature body weight can be estimated for your herd by measuring some fourth lactation animals, roughly 100 to 200 days in lactation. That will give you a good representation of what the mature cow body weight is for your herd, because it does vary by herd a bit. Now, in terms of breeding Holsteins, our target for breeding is at 55 to 57% of mature body weight. So again, if we have a mature body weight of 700 kilos, that means we're targeting a weight of somewhere around 390 kilos for first service. And we can't focus just on the weight. We have to also keep in mind the height of the animal. And we do like for these animals to be 85 to 90% of mature height, where height to me is defined as the withers. So I'm talking about 1.3 meters height approximately for a breeding target for these animals. And again, if we've done a good job of growing these animals from a feeding and management perspective, we can meet those targets at 13, 14, 15 months of age without too much difficulty. And then if we continue to feed them and grow them well, we'll have these animals calving in at about 650 kilos just before calving, or about 580 to 600 kilos just after calving. Those are our targets. Now, I'm guessing that many of you have heifers that don't reach those targets. And so what that does is represent for us a lost opportunity, because the animals that are undersized at calving will never produce the amount of milk that they're capable of producing in the first lactation. And I'll explain a bit more of that in just a minute as we go forward. At calving, we expect animals to be at about 95% of the mature height, because as animals age, they're not going to gain much more in terms of stature. They're going to put some more weight on, but not much more in terms of height. And then, of course, we want the body condition to be a nice moderate condition, so roughly about a 3 on a 1 to 5 scale. I've also shown here some other post-calving weight targets. And my point here is that animals don't stop growing when they calve in. They continue to grow. And that's why I suggested that the mature cow body weight needs to target the measurement of a fourth lactation animal, because in most scenarios, animals are continuing to grow through first, second, and third lactation. It's just that we're trying to target better growth prior to calving, so there's less need for growth after they've calved the first time. Now here's some example data from a herd in the US that's doing a very good job with heifer growth and development. So on the lower axis, you can see from 0 to 700, that's the age in days. And then on the vertical axis is the weight in kilos. And if we look at this, this herd has taken animals from about 40 kilos to about 600 kilos in about 650 days. So on average, it's about 0.86 kilos per day. They're doing a very good job. The thing I want to point out here is if we look at weight, animals should be at about half of the weight we're targeting by about 11 months. So it's a pretty even distribution of weight gain across time. However, if we look at height, it's a bit of a different story. So here we've got the same herd, again, doing a very good job with getting not only the weight gain, but also the frame growth. And again, we're taking heifers from 0.8 meters to 1.4 meters over that same 600-day period. But look at when a heifer has reached half of her height growth. It's basically now by 6 months and not by 11 months. So the point here is that heifers grow more in stature at an early age, and in order to grow properly from a stature perspective, and again, have lean tissue gain, they need adequate levels of protein to support that. And it's very difficult to catch an animal up if she has not been prepared early at a young age. Not only is it difficult, it's also very expensive to try to catch animals up later in terms of gaining height. It's just very difficult to do, and it's very costly. So if we kind of break this down into different stages, here we've got an animal, let's assume she's about 39 kilos at birth, and we're targeting a weaning age of 63 to 70 days. And let's say we've got a target in mind of 90 kilos. Well, in order to get that done, that requires about 0.78 kilos per day. And it could be a little more, that'd be great. It could be a little less and still be acceptable, but it puts us in a kind of a ballpark of what we like to see for, a better than average herd. If we look at the growth from weaning to breeding, we've got about 300 to 320 kilos to gain in that little less than a year, and that takes about 0.86 kilos per day. Now, this is actually a time in the animal's life where we can really take advantage of a very efficient, very fast growth potential if we provide the right nutritional management. But simply giving them a low protein, inexpensive ration is not going to support that rate of gain during that time period. Once we have them bred, we're trying to get that gain to continue on from breeding through to calving. And again, it's going to be slightly less than the previous stage, but still should be a pretty aggressive rate of gain. And again, aggressive here is not throwing the calories to the animals. It's feeding a ration that's balanced both in calories and protein so that we continue to get lean tissue gain without making heifers overly fat. So it's that provision of protein that helps to guide that process. So what happens, given that I've talked so much about growth performance, what happens when heifers are not grown properly before calving? Well, the reality is if they're not grown before calving, they're going to try to grow more during first lactation. And what happens there in that scenario is that an animal that's growing more during first lactation is using more nutrients for growth. In other words, she's using less nutrients for milk production. And what happens is it yields less milk not only in first lactation, but less total lifetime milk production because we haven't prepared these animals appropriately for the right size at first calving. Now, if you think about this, there's potentially, let's say 500 liters or more of milk not produced during the first lactation due to inadequate size at calving. So that's a big lost opportunity. And under current economic conditions, that lost milk represents about 100 pounds of lost profit potential or more just in the first lactation, not even accounting for ongoing losses across her lifetime.
Mike, just got a question for you. So for block calving herds where yield isn't the primary driver, how would the insufficient growth affect fertility?
So tell me again where yield is not the driver?
So for block calving herds, when they're aiming more for fertility to get them in that tight block and perhaps a greater influence on constituents rather than yield, is there any information about how that would affect ability to get in calf?
Yeah, so first of all, when I talk about yield, I don't mean just simply fluid milk yield. I'm also talking about components. So we could be talking energy corrected milk, or we could be talking pounds of fat or pounds of protein. They're somewhat interchangeable. So just make sure that when you hear me say milk production, I'm not focused just on fluid milk, but also on the total solids being produced, number one. But number two, in that particular situation, we have to remember that puberty is related to early life nutrition. So when we do a better job of feeding and raising these animals, we're actually going to achieve puberty at an earlier time. And we also know that optimal fertility is not reached until an animal has achieved, for example, 3, 4, 5 cycles. So achieving an earlier puberty is going to be correlated to better potential fertility when we do try to breed them. So to me, that's still a very important process to consider, even in a block calving scenario, Emily.
Thank you.
Now, I've talked about some of the problems, and I don't want you to walk away from here today thinking that I'm talking about just the UK. I've spent quite a bit of time in the UK, but what I'm going to show you right now is that this problem exists all over the world. And the example I'm going to show you is from the US. So one of the things I do when I evaluate performance, production performance in herds, is I like to look at the peak milk performance of first lactation animals compared to the peak performance of mature cows. And the goal I have is 80 to 82%. So first lactation should be about 80 to 82% of the mature cows in terms of peak level of production. So I took a look at a data sample, 120,000 Holsteins from the US. Average first lactation peak was about 36 liters. Average lactation greater than 1 peak was 48 liters. So if you do the math, that's about 75% ratio between first lactation and mature cows. Now, what would have happened? What was the production potential if peak was actually 80%? Well, 80% of 48 liters is 38.5 liters. That's 2.5 liters per day more at peak. We also have to remember that 1 liter more peak is equivalent to about 250 more liters expected over total lactation. So that difference, that deficiency in peak in the first lactation animals, is roughly about 600 liters of lost milk production in the first lactation. So again, just illustrating how not meeting some of our targets in terms of productivity, which is related to growth and management, affects the herd from a profitability perspective. And this is what we refer to as a lost opportunity. You don't write a check for this bill, you just failed to get paid for the milk that the animals could have produced for you. So that's why we refer to it as a lost opportunity.
Mark,
Absolutely.
Sorry. Yep. How would milking frequency affect this? So what's acceptable?
Yeah, milking frequency is definitely going to affect it. When we go from a 2x to a 3x, we're going to expect to see an increase in productivity. So it's best to evaluate first lactation animals to mature cows within the constraints of having them with the same milking frequency. So in other words, if your older cows are milk 3x, then heifers should be 3x for the careful comparison. But the relationship should be similar in terms of that 80 to 82% peak relationship. Milking more often increases productivity. Milking more often increases productivity though across the board for regardless of the parity of the animal. So I'd still expect there to be a similar relationship in terms of the comparison between first and mature cows.
Thank you.
Okay. So how do we achieve higher gains during pre-weaning period and achieve good post-weaning performance? It starts before calving. So we need good transition cow management, followed by newborn calf management. We're going to talk about this, feeding management, whether it's colostrum, whether it's milk, calf starter. Again, we're going to touch on each of these a bit more. I'm going to talk about how do we wean calves more appropriately, and then focus again a bit more on comfort. I'm talking here primarily cold stress, and then reducing disease risk by a combination of vaccination, all the above things. I am not going to talk about vaccinations today. There's too much variation geography-wise in terms of what should be vaccinated and what shouldn't, and so I'm just not going to touch on that today. But let's cover some transition cow factors briefly here. So I'm going to assume that we're trying to target a 50 to 60-day dry period. And I'm going to assume that when possible, we're going to have 2 dry cow groups. I know it's not always possible. I grew up on a 60 cow dairy in North Carolina, so I understand some of the challenges if we're a smaller dairy. But the optimal in my mind is a 2-group system where cows spend 30 to 40 days in a far dry group, and roughly 3 weeks or so in a close-up dry group. And the reason for that is that we can feed them slightly differently. We can save a little money by having a 2-group system. We can target their specific needs a bit better in a 2-group system versus having a single dry cow group. Regardless of the approach taken, we are going to try to control the energy throughout the entire dry period. So you can see the energetics are very similar in terms of far dry and close-up dry cow feeding. The close-up dry cows can get a little bit more energy. They tend to have a slightly lower intakes than the far dry. And so we still want to make sure we provide sufficient energy. But the other thing that's a little different is we're going to more greatly restrict the starch in the far dry compared to the close-up. The close-up, we're going to pick up on the starch just a little bit. But here's where the bigger difference comes in, and that is in the level of metabolizable protein. Now, metabolizable protein guidelines are about 1,000 grams per day for a far dry cow. And that's actually not very difficult to meet. We don't have to feed a lot of extra protein to get that. That's actually very, very doable. The challenge comes in meeting the close-up dry cow metabolizable protein needs. The guidelines that most people talk about here are somewhere between 1,200 and 14 grams per day. And if we're feeding a close-up dry cow that has at risk of declining intake as she approaches calving, and we're keeping the energy density down and the starch level down, there's no other way to provide this protein to her than by feeding high quality protein to make up the deficits that she's not able to make in her rumen. So that's a very difficult and sometimes a more costly ration to feed, but it's important in terms of targeting good quality colostrum and getting these animals off to the production start that they are capable of after calving. In terms of the calving environment, of course, I've mentioned this before, but clean, dry, comfortable. And for these animals, ideally, of course, good footing. We need good air quality. Ideally, we'd like these calving animals to be separate from the sick cows, so we don't have that risk of pathogen transfer. From a social issue, it's ideal if the animal has the ability to kind of move, separate herself a bit from the group. I don't mean necessarily in a whole separate pen, but sometimes creating blinds or something where an animal can kind of get away from the rest of the herd can be beneficial. We need to make sure we have the ability to assist the animals if needed, if she has calving challenges. And of course, we need to know when to call for help and how to intervene if we're going to do it ourselves. But it's very important to understand when we need to call for help. Now, when that calf is born, we've got to make sure we take care of it as well. And I've got some different pictures shown here on the right that may or may not fit your scenario. But of course, we need to make sure the animal is breathing well. And so the first challenge is making sure we clean the mouth and nostrils and to sit that calf in the right position. Now, I prefer to rub them vigorously with hands or a towel. And if an animal is not breathing, the best bet for me is to pour some ice cold water over its head or in its ear. It stimulates a gasp response and gets these animals breathing probably better than about anything else we can do. Calf removal, well, that depends on local regulations and philosophies. My own personal opinion is I prefer to get the calf away from the cow once the calf is starting to stand. And I do that for risk management perspectives. Again, I recognize there may be rules and regulations that differ around the world. In my perspective, I like to see the calf be licked by the cow, cleaned up by the cow. That provides benefits both to the cow and to the calf. But once the calf is up on its feet and trying to suckle, I prefer to separate the two and then provide a known quantity of colostrum in a clean, sanitary way to get that calf provided with the right level of antibodies, immunoglobulins, and overall nutrients from colostrum. Also would like to disinfect the navel of that calf very quickly with strong iodine. And I want to caution you against using teat dips. Teat dips typically have some emollient system in there that helps keep the teat skin moist, and that's not what we want to have happen for the navel itself. We actually want the navel, the umbilicus, to actually dry to provide an extra barrier against bacteria gaining access to the calf. And of course, we want to warm and dry the calf. Sometimes, if it's a really cold environment, we may have calves that get dried in a little blower box, a heat box. Other times we just use towels. And sometimes we just let the cow take care of it. But the key is if the calf has been really cold stressed, we want to warm that calf up. And sometimes we even apply a blanket to it, depending on the environment, before we move that calf to its housing area. And the picture at the bottom is a really nice picture to show the benefits of deep, well-bedded straw. That's an animal, you can't see its legs. It's basically nestled down in the straw. That's optimal in terms of trying to allow the calf the ability to help thermoregulate itself by providing additional bedding that it can actually nest down in. And of course, you can't forget about colostrum. Before I go to colostrum, I do want to make one quick point here about positioning the calf to help it breathe. I remember back over the years seeing many instances where people would grab a calf by its hind legs and then hang it upside down for a few minutes to try and get all the fluid to drain out of the calf. Well, that is not recommended, and here's why. Holding the calf upside down does promote fluid to drain, but I want to remind you that most of the fluid you see draining out of the calf is actually not coming from the lungs, it's actually coming from its stomach. And so holding upside down longer does promote fluid coming out, but it's primarily coming from the abomasum and not the lungs. But number two, and more importantly, is holding the calf upside down before it has taken its first breath makes it much more difficult for the calf to ever take its first breath. Because upside down, it's got its stomach, its intestines, and everything pushing against its diaphragm, and that creates difficulties of having the first breath taken. So the best thing to do is you can pick them up quickly that way if you like, but the best approach is to get that calf in sternal position, which is kind of shown in the lower left picture. It's easier for it to actually expand its lungs and to take a good deep breath and start breathing normally. I mentioned colostrum. Calf care basically is not complete without a good colostrum program. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about colostrum feeding and handling guidelines. In general, we want to harvest colostrum as quickly as possible after birth. Again, I recognize on small dairies this can be a really big challenge because we don't have people there 24 hours a day, and it creates some big challenges of getting colostrum harvested. But I will remind you that the quality of colostrum does deteriorate with time. So the longer we delay the milking to collect the colostrum, the more risk we have of the quality deteriorating. We want to harvest that colostrum and maintain it in a clean, sanitary manner. So there's different guidelines here. And if we do that well, we generally don't pasteurize colostrum, but there can be different reasons for wanting to pasteurize colostrum. If you do choose to pasteurize, we have to make sure we do it very cautiously. We never want to exceed 60 degrees C, or you will damage the colostrum. You'll basically make yogurt, it'll damage it, gel it up, and you lose all the ability to benefit from antibodies here. You also want to feed colostrum as soon as possible after birth. So not only is it important to get it from the cow quickly, it's important to get it into the calf quickly. And there are times where we'll actually feed pre-warmed colostrum to a calf in order to get the colostrum into the calf, and that colostrum doesn't actually come from its dam. It comes from a different one. It's just a matter of convenience to try to get the colostrum into the calf as soon as possible. We know that the absorption of antibodies from the colostrum deteriorate across time. And I used to tell my students that it was a little bit of a race between us and the bacteria. We wanted to get the colostrum in place in the calf before bacteria had a chance to take their place in the calf. And so getting colostrum in early is a very important step. And of course, we want to try to use good quality colostrum. So good quality colostrum to me is defined by basically the density or the concentration of IgGs. We don't typically have the ability to measure that directly, but there are some other ways we can measure, which I'll show you in a minute. If you have good quality colostrum and you have bad quality colostrum, we want to prioritize the feeding of the good quality colostrum for the first feeding, and we can use the lower quality for subsequent feedings. And in an ideal scenario, we would like to be able to feed some of that transition milk for the first few days following the feeding of colostrum. So if you've got transition milk, it's great to use it in this age calf. If you don't, we can go on to regular milk or milk replacer, but there's some real unique benefits of feeding the transition milk. Was there a question?
Yeah, a couple of questions, Mike, thank you. Do you recommend enrichment or replacement of colostrum?
So my own preference is if I can get enough good quality colostrum from my cow herd, I'm going to feed that. I want to harvest it cleanly. I want to feed a large volume. If I don't have enough colostrum, we can use a colostrum replacement. But when you talk about colostrum replacements, make sure we are talking replacements and not supplements. The concentrations of IgGs present in a replacement or a colostrum replacer versus a colostrum supplement are vastly different. So if you're going to choose that, make sure you choose a good quality replacer and not simply a supplement. If I can get enough good quality colostrum, I don't want to use either one, but if I don't have enough, then I'll drop back and use the replacer.
Okay, thank you. And if a calf has been nursed before you get to it, how would you identify how much colostrum to feed? And how would the dam's colostrum quality be affected by the fact the calf has sucked already?
Okay, so good questions. I'm laughing because I had this exact same conversation several years ago when I was working with the dairy in South Carolina. So what I told the guys there, and this was a smaller dairy where they picked the calves up several times a day, and oftentimes early morning, they would go out to get the calf and realize that, well, the calf was up and running around, and for sure it had likely already suckled. So what I told them is if the calf was still wet and wobbly on its feet, legs, I would assume the calf has had minimal, if any, colostrum, and I would go ahead and feed it normal. But if the calf was dried and standing securely, I would suspect that it already nursed the cow. Now, nursing the cow is not going to harm the colostrum quality of the cow. It just increases the risk that the calf gets something it should not have, such as manure from the cow's teat or cow's hide or something like that. So that's why I'm talking about separating and feeding to intentionally actually get a set volume of colostrum in. And what I told those guys in that situation is if we suspected the calf had already suckled, we were going to lower the amount of colostrum we provided to the calf by half. Because if you think about it, and I'll get to this recommendation in just a minute, we're targeting somewhere between 3 to as much as 4 liters, depending on where you are, of colostrum at the first feeding. Now, a calf suckling the dam very, very, very infrequently is going to suckle more than about 2 liters on its own. So if we find a calf that's dry and standing and walking around, and we assume it has had some colostrum, I'm still very comfortable feeding another 1.5 liters or 2 liters at that time, just to try to provide sufficient, make sure she's had sufficient colostrum. Okay.
Lovely, thank you. And last one on this slide. Why do you say to thaw at 51 degrees but pasteurize at 60? Does this affect colostrum quality?
Absolutely. So we want to pasteurize, and pasteurization is designed to have a large reduction. It doesn't sterilize, but a large reduction of bacteria. So we're going to pasteurize up to about 60 degrees. If we go above that, it creates big challenges. When we thaw colostrum, we're simply trying to warm it rapidly to get it to the right temperature for feeding to the calf. And so if we get it too warm, we could actually damage the immunoglobulins, antibodies. And so we want to make sure we do that carefully. And so one of the best ways of doing that is to basically make sure that the colostrum was frozen in somewhat flat style containers, whether it's Ziploc bags or something similar. But that way we have greater surface area to enhance the thawing process. And we should never be thawing it in a microwave, by the way. Okay.
Thank you.
Now, in terms of the colostrum quality and quantity, our goal is greater than 50 grams per liter of IgG. We don't normally have the ability to measure that directly on the farm, but we can approximate that by using something like a Brix refractometer, or we can look at it by using some type of specific gravity measurement, such as a colostrometer shown on the upper right. We know there are many things that affect colostrum quality, whether the cow was vaccinated properly, whether she was fed properly during the dry cow period. Heat stress affects it. Short dry periods negatively affect colostrum quality and quantity. And again, I talked about the timing of colostrum harvest. So here are the goals that I alluded to previously. So for a typical Holstein calf, a large calf, we've got a recommendation of 3 to 4 liters at birth. 3 liters is a recommendation of AHDB. I say 4 liters just from a risk management. So you're in that target of 3 to 4 liters. That's ideal for the first feeding. And then I want to try and get 2 more liters in within 12 hours. If we can get 5 liters within the first 12 hours to these calves, we should be in very good shape, both from a nutritional perspective and from an antibody or immunoglobulin perspective. Now, below that, I show the recommendations for a smaller calf. Think about jerseys, for example. The initial volume will be lower, and then we're still going to try and come back with 2 more liters within 12 hours. And again, the reminder here is that most calves are not going to voluntarily consume 2 liters from the dam right away. And so if you're going to feed from a bottle, that's fine. Just you have to be patient and have time on your hands to work with calves, because they're ordinarily not going to take 3 liters right away at birth. So that's why many producers choose to deliver colostrum via tube feeder in order to try and ensure an adequate volume of colostrum has been delivered. Now, I've talked about colostrum. We know that colostrum is very, very valuable from many different perspectives. From a nutritional perspective, it's much better than milk, but it also contains many other factors. In between the column 1, which is colostrum, and column 6, which is milk, I've got what I call transition milk. So these are the milkings after colostrum, after calving. And what I wanted to point out here is that when a cow calves, she doesn't go straight from from colostrum to milk. There's this transition. So in that in-between time, her milk is transitioning over to true milk from colostrum, but the nutrients and the components change across time. There are many non-nutritive factors in colostrum and in transition milk that we think have a very positive impact on the health and future productivity of these calves. Things like IGF-1 and growth hormone and insulin. These are things that mom puts in her colostrum, in her transition milk, to help the calf get off to a better start. And so this is why I encourage not only large volumes of colostrum, but trying to follow that up with transition milk if we have the luxury of doing that. So here's a practical recommendation for feeding. Let's try and get at least 3 liters in at birth and another 2 liters within 12 hours for a typical Holstein calf. Again, remember that quality declines across time, and the absorption is going to be impacted if we have contaminated colostrum. So that's another reason to keep the colostrum clean and as free as possible from bacterial contamination. We're going to try to feed this transition milk over the first 3 or 4 days of life if you have it available. If you don't have enough to feed it full feeding for 3 or 4 days, if you could at least feed partially transition milk along with milk replacer or whole milk, that would actually be better than nothing. That provides some additional benefits for the calf. So we're just trying to utilize this better nutritional value product instead of simply diluting it in the milk and feeding it across all calves. We're trying to target the administration of this lower quality colostrum or transition milk in the very youngest calves to try to get them off to a better start. Now,
Mike,
historically, yes.
Oh, sorry. If a cow is milked 8 hours after calving, the IgG level would go down, but by how much? And just trying to put some numbers. You put declines with delays in milking.
Yeah, I can't give you an exact number there. We do know that the quality starts declining after about 5 or 6 hours. And similarly, delaying the feeding of colostrum to a calf carries with it a reduction in the efficiency of absorption. But that varies also with how much the calf has consumed of anything else. For example, if it gets a mouthful of bedding or manure or something, it's going to start gut closure faster. So delaying the harvesting of colostrum 8 hours, 10 hours does carry with it the risk of lower quality. We still want to collect it, we still want to feed it, but we definitely want to test that type of colostrum because chances are it may be lower quality than if we were to harvest it within a couple of hours of her giving birth. So the key there is going to be to test it with the Brix or a colostrometer or something to try to get some type of proxy for its quality. But don't discard it. You can feed it one way or another. It just may not be optimal for first feeding.
And is there any difference in the uptake of IgG in bottle feeding compared to tube feeding colostrum?
So actually, that is a great question, and the answer to that is no. There's been some research done to compare colostrum absorption, whether by bottle or by tube feeder, and there was no difference. So you can rest assured that no matter which way you choose to do it, you're going to get a similar level of absorption. The key is the quantity, the quality into the calf, and then the timeliness of that administration.
Thank you.
Okay, good questions. Historically, and I'm talking not recommendation, but what has been done in the past was to feed 4 liters of a 2020 milk replacer mixed at a level that achieved 12% solids. And why do people do that? Well, similar to what I described before, it was a lower replacement cost. They fed less milk, and they could stimulate calves to eat calf starter earlier. But the problem with that is we had many health problems. We had poor rates of growth. And if you think about it, for a 40-kilo calf at 22 degrees C, a 4 liters per day of a 2020 milk replacer contains barely enough nutrients to gain up to about 200 grams per day. But you throw in some cold or hot and rainy weather, and these calves, especially with cold, rainy weather, will be losing weight rapidly with 4 liters of 2020 per day. I kind of sort of, maybe inappropriately, joke about this as being the semi-starvation diet. It's not really a laughing matter, but it points out the inadequacies of this feeding approach. And on the right-hand side, the lower right side, you can see a picture on a necropsy of a calf where they've opened up its abdomen. They look in the abdomen at the intestines and mesentery, and what you do not see here is any fat whatsoever. And that's because this calf is literally starved in the cold environment it was in, did not get enough calories, and burned all of its fat internally, trying to keep itself warm and maintain its body, and it just failed. So we have to make sure we provide extra nutrients to these calves, especially during cold, stressful conditions. And they also need the ability to nest. I mentioned nesting earlier. The top picture, you can see a calf with a nice clean calf jacket in straw. And on the bottom picture, you can see an even better picture of adequate straw. And it's better because you can't see these calves' legs. They have sufficiently deep straw to allow them to nest down into the straw. On the left side, you can see a calf hutch, which is nice and clean and dry. And if this is in late spring or early summer, that's ideal. It's nice, it's clean, it's dry, it has good ventilation. But if this is in the winter, that's not acceptable because the calf has no ability to help itself thermoregulate. So it can be very susceptible to cold stress. And it takes more milk in this circumstance just to keep a calf alive and keep it growing than it does if the calf is in a more thermoneutral environment. So again, better colostrum, transition milk feeding, and then greater milk feeding throughout the wet calf feeding period has been shown to lead to better health outcomes, greater growth, and more future milk production. This is a compilation of a number of studies I'm showing in the lower half of this slide, but Dr. Soperone and Van Amberg at Cornell University published this, and they showed that based on some of the statistical techniques they used, for every additional 1/10 of a kilo increase in pre-weaning average daily gain, they found that milk production in first lactation increased 154 kilos. So again, imagine going from that kind of bare bones double calf birth weight to that more aggressive approach. You're looking at 250, 300 kilos more milk potential in first lactation based on better rate of gains, more healthy, more efficient animals being fed from colostrum and milk. So just another level of motivation around this feeding more colostrum and milk, totally independent of the health itself. So in terms of milk feeding phase, my recommendations, I like to try to increase the solids level of milk to about 14%. So milk replacer, we're talking about 140 grams within a liter of final volume. We're talking about using a high quality replacer that's got very digestible ingredients. For me, I prefer milk-based milk replacer or whole milk. And I like to have replacers that are higher in protein, but still have acceptable levels of fat. That could be 2618 all the way up to 2820 for Holsteins. All of those are acceptable. We want to try to feed 12 to 15% of body weight during the first week of life. So that typically means about 3 liters twice a day for a 40 kilo calf. And 6 liters of 14% solids milk replacer is about 840 grams of milk solids. So in other words, is enough milk solids there to support its maintenance and slight growth in the first week. And then we want to increase the amount being fed to about 20% of body weight. So 20% of body weight is 3 liters 3 times a day. Alternatively, you could feed 4 liters twice a day. But if we think about 9 liters a day of 14% solids, that's about 1,260 grams of milk solids. So there's enough solids there to support our higher rate of gain, at least until the calf is able to consume some more calf starter to help complement the milk that's being consumed. We're going to try to maintain the 9 liters per day until about day 50. We don't want to start weaning too early. And then we're going to lower the milk to 2 liters twice a day for a week. And then we're going to lower it to 1 liter twice a day or 2 liters once a day for another week. So in other words, we're stepping down the amount of milk being fed. It's not turning the switch off all of a sudden. We got to help stimulate some additional calf starter intake, and we're going to help transition that calf by stepping down the milk versus just yanking the rug out from under it, so to speak. Our target is to try to wean calves when their starter intake is at least 1 to 2 kilos per day for 3 consecutive days or more. But as a general rule, the higher the volume of milk at peak intake, the longer and more gradual the weaning process should be. If you don't feed a lot of milk, it's not going to be as difficult for the calf to transition to the starter. But if you do feed a lot, which many people are recommending, you got to be more careful as you wean them down. And so what I've provided today is a little bit of an kind of a intermediate to above average approach for feeding, which should meet most of their nutritional needs. You have to be aware, though, if you do feed higher milk volumes, that feeding more milk that's clean, properly mixed, and high quality does not cause scours. Now, it is true that if you feed more milk, the feces are going to be softer than normal because there's a lot more volume involved. But that does not mean calves have diarrhea. And think about it for a minute. If you've got a newborn baby in your house that's nursing a lot, they're going to have loose to pasty stools. And the more milk they consume, the looser they get. That's a normal process. Unfortunately, when we limit feed calves milk and they don't get very much, we've come to accept that the dry, firm feces we see from young calves as being normal, when in fact, that's not really normal. Calves should be a little bit looser because they should be consuming more milk. As the calf starts to eat calf starter, that will help firm up the feces some, but again, early on, the lack of calf starter also contributes to softer feces. And so as we're trying to stimulate starter intake, we want to start by providing small amounts of fresh, high quality starter every day, starting just a few days of age. Remove it, replace it each day with fresh starter. And as that calf begins to eat, you provide more calf starter. And of course, it's important the calf has access to fresh, clean water every day as well. That also contributes to helping them to start on starter intake. Now, I can't go through all of this without at least one slide talking about sanitation. And I'm borrowing some advice from Sam Leagley here, who is a veterinarian in the northeastern part of the US, who does a lot of work around calf and calf care. His recommendations are to rinse the utensils with lukewarm water, not hot water, to get that dirt and the milk residue off, and then to wash in hot water with detergent and bleach or some type of chlorinated detergent. And his recommendation is to use the brush to try to get the milk residue off all the different surfaces. Then you want to rinse, and he suggests rinsing with the warm water acid solution as another form of disinfection, and then to stack the containers so that they can dry. And the key here is to allow them to dry completely, because that's also a key portion of the sanitation. Is to dry these things. So you see racks there on the lower right where they've got nipples set up so they can dry. And I've seen some small dairies actually put in dishwashers just for the nipples to try to get those good and clean. But the key is to clean them appropriately and then have them to dry, not just to stack the milk pails on top of each other, but make sure that all the utensils have the ability to dry. Calf rumen development and feeding, again, it's important to remember that the calf, when it's born, is not a ruminant. It's got a rumen, but it's not developed. So we have to work with this calf to help develop its rumen, and that requires that the calf begins eating grain, drinking water, getting the right bacteria inoculated into the digestive system, and that process takes many weeks to months to accomplish. So it's a gradual process. We have to remember that when we're feeding these calves. So calf starter is just the initial phase. We're trying to encourage them to eat starter early to meet their transition nutritional needs. Remember that calves prefer textured starter. They don't like lots of fines and dust. It should be fresh. And when the calf is really starting to eat, it should be provided free choice so they can eat as much as they want. I like to have the protein up a bit on calf starter compared to where it normally might sit for most people. So if we could target a 22, 23% crude protein, that's probably sufficient with enough molasses to make it palatable, provide enough of a fermentable energy boost from that sugary content. Now, general thoughts about weaning. We can do a good job of feeding calves colostrum and milk and then have it all fall apart by not weaning these animals correctly. So transitioning from milk to non-milk is more complicated than most people think. Remember, these calves are on a high quality milk diet, and we're trying to get them transitioned to a lower quality grain-based diet that's usually lower in protein. And we're also taking this calf that's not really fully functioning as a ruminant, and we're expecting her to utilize that rumen to get some extra nutrients out of the feed that we're providing. And so that's why it's so important that we encourage starter intake early, that we help to do a better job of developing that calf's GI tract, so that when we do get her over on grain and then introduce some forage, we can have her in the best possible position to continue growing given that change of diet. So general weaning guidelines, we normally like to wean at about 8 or 10 weeks, but again, remember, it's based on when the calf is eating sufficient amounts of starter and not simply based on an age. We're going to try to step down the feeding as I described. Once we have an animal weaned, we're going to like to keep them separated for another week or so to make sure the intake is where we want it to be before we put them into small group pens. And small group pens, 6 or 8 calves, no more per pen, even numbers if possible, and then continue feeding that same kind of grain during that time period if possible. It's becoming well known now that calves benefit from being in small groups with an even number of animals, because they tend to kind of buddy up with a friend, so to speak. And so that's why we try to wean them in groups of 6 or so to try to help that process.
Mike, I've just got a question. Now, sorry, I should have said before. How important is forage? What is best, hay, straw, or TMR? And also, you could mention about truck length.
Sure. So the straw, in terms of young calves, is still somewhat controversial, and it depends on which paper, which research you read. In my opinion, I think there's increasing evidence that having a smaller amount, 5% maybe, of the starter grain mix to be finely chopped small grain hay or grass hay is probably ideal. I don't want more than about 5%, so we're talking a very small mix. I like it to be mixed with the calf starter, and then as the calf is weaned onto the grower grain, at the time of weaning, we're probably going to have about 90% grower grain and 10% hay. And over the next month or so, we're going to shift that to 80% grain, 20% hay. But the hay should be a good quality grass, small grain, alfalfa type of hay that's going to provide sufficient protein and be very palatable for the calf. And we're not going to really introduce a TMR that contains fermented grass or maize silage until about 4.5, maybe even 5 months of age, ideally. So that's my thoughts about that. Very small amount of chopped dry hay mixed with the starter grain at maybe a 5% level would be great for the wet calves.
Thank you.
Now, one of the consequences of not properly feeding, housing, managing these calves, as I've already mentioned, is a disease called respiratory disease. Sometimes we call it BRD, sometimes we call it pneumonia, but we're talking about the same thing. Consequences vary. There's some that occur right away. We'll see things like a sick calf that's down in feed intake. We have to treat with antimicrobials and anti-inflammatories, and then some of these will also die. So definitely bad outcomes. But some of the things we see associated with pneumonia or respiratory disease are more delayed. We may have a risk of retreatment later, a higher culling risk. We can have a delay in first breeding for these animals as heifers, delay in first calving. And we can also see significant potential carryover effects into first lactation, where they produce less milk and have a higher culling risk as a lactating animal. So I created an economic model to try to evaluate this, and there are a lot of assumptions used, but in the model, I'm going to assume that I'm actually trying to model a Holstein dairy with about 100 total heifers. I'm going to assign a newborn heifer value of about 174 pounds and a birth weight of about 39 kilos. And labor costs, I've got at 11 pounds, 6% cost of capital. And let's assume that we've got a breeding weight of about 390, 395 kilos, a cost per service of 16 pounds. And we're going to allow these animals up to 6 21-day cycles of breeding for breeding management. Now, in the model, I have set in as an instance of BRD prior to 120 days of age of about 37%, and an average of 1.7 treatments per initial respiratory disease case. Now that is based on samplings from numerous farm records, about 104,000 dairy heifers that I have assembled and put together for a publication. If we compare animals without BRD, which is the top half, to animals with BRD, which is the bottom half, in the very middle, you can see the original mortality risk for my model, which includes a blend of the two. So if we go from an original mortality risk of 11%, for example, taking away BRD in the model lowers that to about 8, but having BRD, I'm saying increases it to about 14%, or about 1.7 times higher risk of mortality, dead calves. I've also assumed, though, that in the BRD population, we're going to remove by culling some of the worst affected animals that do not die. And overall, that culling risk is more than double what it would be in a population without BRD. Now, here's the kicker. Many herds do not cull heifers. And I understand that to a certain point. But remember, if you do not cull heifers and you calve all of these animals that are chronically affected into your herd, you're going to be more likely to see negative consequences of the carryover effects of disease in first lactation. So in this example, I've chosen to cull some animals at different time points based on the presence and the severe impact of BRD. Now, so that's important in my opinion, but it's also costly. And so what I've assumed here is that when we cull heifers, whether it's at 2.5 months of age or 4.5 months of age, what we receive in terms of revenue doesn't come close to covering the cost incurred thus far for raising. So consequently, what we see is that there's a loss per heifer culled. But it's kind of a situation of, do I take a loss now or do I take a loss in the future? And I'm trying to assume that we're going to take a loss early and yield a better quality animal at the very end. If we fail to cull those worst affected animals, we are expecting to see more of a negative carryover of respiratory disease in the future. Now, what I did to kind of account for a little bit of a carryover effect, but not very much since I'm culling the worst affected animals, is I went back to that study I talked to you about earlier at the differences in the pre-weaning gain. And based on that difference for the BRD heifers, I assume they would produce about 120 kilos less milk in first lactation. And that represents a cost of about 21 pounds of value for these animals. But remember, if you don't do any selective culling, the milk losses and productive life are likely to be more negatively impacted after calving of these more severely affected animals. So this is the total raising cost. On the left are animals without BRD, on the right are animals with BRD. But the big take home I wanted to focus on is this big summary slide here. So I estimated the cost in the UK system for raising heifers in this manner to be about 1,700 British pounds for animals without BRD and about 1,869 pounds for those with BRD. And so the difference between those two would be the cost of BRD. So if we simply subtract 1,701 from 1,869, that gives us a cost of 168 pounds per animal with BRD. Now, if we add in the milk lost in first lactation of 21 pounds of net value, that takes the cost of BRD up to 189 pounds. So as you can see here, we're much better off to focus on prevention rather than simply waiting to diagnose and treat to try to lessen the loss. We want to try to prevent as many of these losses as possible so that we can see the production potential of these heifers when they finally do calve. So, summary, I pointed out that I think a lot of the health issues we see in calves and heifers can be prevented with better management. We're talking about colostrum, nutritional management, housing management, the weaning management, and of course, preventive health, which we didn't have time to talk about today. So under the assumptions I showed you here, the case of BRD in Holstein replacement heifers in the UK that occurs in the first 120 days of life is a roughly 100, let's call it 175 pounds. And it could be more or less depending on whether you consider the lost milk production potential in the first lactation. And again, these cost estimates I showed you are assuming that poor performing heifers were culled prior to first calving. And so if they're not, we're going to have to account for much more negative carryover effects in the first lactation. So we expect to see more milk loss and greater premature removal risk after calving. So again, take home, let's do everything we can to raise a healthier, more well-grown heifer in order to optimize her production potential in the first lactation and over her lifetime. Starts with colostrum, but don't forget about the importance of nutrition and housing and weeding management as well. So with that, Emily, Stephen, I'll turn it back over. I'll mention again the AHDB tools and resources that are available online. And again, I thank you for your attention today. Thanks for joining me for the webinar, and thanks for the good questions.
Thank you so much, Mike. We do have a couple more questions, so I know we're just running over, but if we can, we'll nip through these. If you leave colostrum over 24 hours because you have spare, will that still be as good as fresh colostrum? And then leading on from that, how long can you keep colostrum in a fridge, and does the quality deteriorate if stored correctly?
Okay, so good questions. In general, I recommend that colostrum that is not fed immediately be stored in the refrigerator, and you want to be able to chill it rapidly. So if you've got a large pail, you might want to divide it into smaller aliquots so they can chill more quickly. The chilling helps reduce bacterial growth. And so if you can do that and handle it properly, then it's perfectly fine to store it in the refrigerator for 2 or 3 days. After that, it either needs to be fed or frozen, but don't keep it longer than 2 or 3 days. The quality should still be satisfactory to feed, should not be any impacts on immunoglobulins, provided we don't have excessive bacterial growth. So again, harvest it cleanly, handle it cleanly, store it so that you chill it quickly, and then warm it back up before you feed it. Okay.
Thank you. One more. How does the fat and protein percent of a calf milk replacer relate to that of whole milk? All the milk replacer protein fat suggestions ratio on the slide had higher protein than fat, and cow's milk usually has higher fat than protein.
Absolutely. So if you look at whole milk, depending on what the fat percent and the protein percent are, whole milk from a cow is going to almost always be higher in fat than protein. If you look at milk replacer tends to be higher in protein versus fat, hence the 28-20 type of replacer I recommended. So there's a couple of things involved there. Number one, when we feed whole milk, the fatty acid profile of whole milk is usually a bit different than the fatty acid profile of milk replacer. And that fatty acid profile has some different effects on how the calf utilizes the fat and how it's stored. When we feed a milk replacer, we tend to feed a higher protein replacer to try to promote lean tissue gain, lean tissue accretion, i.e. the protein-based tissue gain, without excessive fattening. And if we fed higher levels of fat in a replacer, we would tend to incur a risk of greater fattening potential versus the lean tissue gain. So it's not a mistake. We tend to see milk replacers higher in protein versus fat, but as you pointed out, whole milk from the cow is going to be higher in fat, but calves are going to be well conditioned on whole milk, but they don't tend to get overly conditioned in that situation. Okay,
there's a couple more good ones. Will the use of a straw chopper rather than hand bedding increase the chances of BRD?
So I'm assuming when we talk about the straw chopper, we're talking about increasing the amount of dust and particulate matter that's in the environment. So that's certainly a potential concern. Although if we have low levels of ammonia, low levels of humidity, and the air quality itself otherwise is pretty good, I would expect the risk of the particulate matter that is temporary from the blowing in of straw to not be a big issue, but it potentially could be. And it could certainly be a confounder on top of poor underlying environmental conditions.
Okay, thank you. And then we will make this the last one. What level of IgG would you advise to look for in a colostrum replacer?
Again, we got to go back to the target we set. We want to achieve somewhere between 100 and 200 grams of IgG ingested by the calf. So you have to look at what's provided in the colostrum replacer, and then look at the volume required to actually try to achieve those targeted levels of intake.
Okay, thank you, Mike. I think we will finish up there. So thank you so much for your time. If you have any more questions, I think you can contact either your local knowledge exchange manager at AHDB or a Zoetis rep. Also remember that all those resources are online or can be ordered from a hard copy. We also actually ran a webinar focusing on vets last week, so it's well worth a discussion to see if your vet engaged with that and talk through what you and they would have learned in this content. And we're going to send an email around afterwards with links to the resources and also a feedback form, so we'd really appreciate it if you could fill that in and let us know with some comments on what you'd like to see more of. So thank you very much, and I think we'll leave it there. Have a good afternoon all. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.